would like to acknowledge and respect the Algonquin-speaking people on whose territory the University of Victoria stands, Songhees and Vastanish people whose relationship with the land continues to this day, whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. This acknowledgement at the University of Victoria is very important because we are on unceded territories. And I have lived in this land as a new migrant and a settler now for more than 25 years. And I acknowledge the fact that I love living here, and therefore I'm very happy to be able to make this acknowledgement every time I teach or every time I organize a meeting with colleagues. So Jeff is a former professor. He's emeritus from Lethbridge University. He's been involved in the work done at Borders and Globalization laboratory, a research laboratory, for nearly 10 years. And he was part of and instrumental to the first grant that we won in 2012, large research grant, and then again in 2021. And so I'm delighted to be able to welcome him. He is one of Canada's foremost specialists of trade relations and policy relations between Canada and the US. So you have a lot to learn from Jeff.
The concept of bordering is central to the discussion of the interaction between trade policy and customs. And the definition that we've used in our research for bordering is our processes for defining, negotiating, or structuring the rights and responsibilities of states towards one another, their respective citizens and residents, in establishing and managing territorial and jurisdictional boundaries between and or cooperation among different political communities. And from listening into the last session, the issue of cooperation among countries and its increasing difficulty is front and center. So whether you are representing a Canadian agency, an agency of one of our trading partners, or an agency from outside the network of trade agreements that Canada has with other countries, I think I think we will get some idea of the increasing complexity of bordering processes for customs management, particularly in the goods area, but also because goods and services are increasingly intermingled. Customs management in relationship to services as well, and the institutional framework for trade and border management, which is evolving considerably these days from where it was when we started looking at these issues more than a decade ago. And the second area that we will look at are medium-term trends and institutional shocks complicating border management. These are the trends that are making the lives of everybody in this room and online more challenging and more complicated as we move forward into the 2020s and towards the 2030s. And you may say, we're talking about the 2030s already. Well, from your own extensive experience in customs, how long does it take to get major projects done in your agencies? And if the answer is 5 years or longer, we're on the cusp of the 2030s. And the third thing we will look at are emerging issues that we are going to have to spend more time on, and that we will likely see more complexities in our jobs on over the next 5 to 10 years. So we have our existing structure, our emerging challenges, some of which go back a few years, and some future-oriented challenges. We will be looking at the institutional framework for trade and border management and its evolution in recent years. We will look at medium-term trends and institutional shocks that are complicating border management. and we will look at emerging issues that are affecting the administration of customs and borders in a number of Western and trade-linked countries. And it is a pleasure to get to know some of you. I was saying that compared with last year's class, I think, except for our Argentinian and Sri Lankan friends, everyone in the class is either working for a Canadian agency of one kind or another, or in working for an agency with whom we have formal trade agreements. And obviously, the core, the center of the international trading system remains the World Trade Organization. And even though the processes of change in this rather cumbersome institution have ground not to a complete halt, to a process resembling glaciation, because we have 164 countries making up virtually all of the world's international trade. The WTO remains the basis for intergovernmental discussions on trade issues, whatever the degree of regionalization that has taken hold in the last 10 or 15 years. Of course, the reason that the WTO is in difficulty is that because of its sheer size and the fact that its processes are consensus-driven and slow-moving as a result of all the back and forth necessary to achieve consensus, it's very difficult to get anything, any new policy developments through. And since 2019, a key element in the working of the WTO for purposes of managing trade disputes, the dispute resolution mechanism, has been substantially gutted by the refusal of the United States to sanction further appointments to the appellate body. This does not mean that everything is frozen. A number of countries, including Canada, China, and the European Union, have signed a subsidiary agreement to allow a parallel dispute mechanism, a resolution mechanism to proceed. And this process remains in place. But policy innovation over the last 10 or 15 years has been largely driven by interregional agreements among major trading regions. And so we have the European Union negotiating agreements with Japan and other countries. We have India negotiating a wide range of trade agreements with major trading countries. We have the emergence of the Pacific Alliance, of which Peru is a charter member, negotiating an expanded trade agreement among its members on the western coast, the Pacific coast of South America, of course, with Mexico being part of that as well. And we have ASEAN countries, the Southeast Asian countries, primarily, negotiating trade agreements with Japan, Australia, New Zealand through the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then more recently with the RCEP with China and Korea. These processes work because they are characterized by a projection of regional trade rules oriented to the priorities of major trading partners. And it would be nice if all countries, large, small, medium-sized, were able to have equal weight in the trading process, but this is not how the world works. And so The challenge for smaller countries is to create a critical mass which can attract the attention of larger countries to be able to develop relatively mutually beneficial trade agreements. And it's interesting that it was, I believe, Singapore, Brunei, and New Zealand that started the TPP process in the early 2000s. But it took the better part of 17 years to make that process move. And it was the decision of the United States to engage that process and then to bring Japan into that process that made the Trans-Pacific Partnership work from a large country perspective. And it's interesting looking at Canada's trade relations in that context. And I think what applied to Canada would apply to some degree to a number of other medium-sized and smaller economies. Canada was not able to win the attention of Japan, but it was able, in the context of trade negotiations between Japan and the United States, with other trans-Pacific players involved, to triangulate trade negotiations so that it could balance its trade-offs in dealing with the United States and dealing with Japan, dealing with the agribusiness combines of South America, and starting to develop relationships with the ASEAN countries who were part of the negotiations. And it's interesting that even though the United States unfortunately backed out of the TPP negotiations after the 2016 presidential election that brought Donald Trump to power, Canada has continued to negotiate with ASEAN, as have a number of other countries in the region. And so the existence of this regional structure enables broadening and deepening. And the challenge for customs officials who are not in the policy process is familiarization with the different processes of different countries with different trade profiles to begin the process of building trust over time, something that came up in your last session. So with these processes, and of course for Canada and Mexico, the renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement into what is now called the USMCA, interestingly enough, different acronyms in each of the three trading participants, the United States, Canada, and Mexico. These regional alliances or regional negotiations have become the basis for ongoing negotiations. That said, you still have a variety of specialized bodies. This course has come together under the auspices of the World Customs Organization, simply to allow interaction among customs officials in different countries on emerging challenges and best practices. At the same time, we have for seaborne trade, the International Maritime Organization. For the growing value of air cargo transport, we have the International Aviation, the IATA, the International Air Transport Association. For agri-food trade, we have the Organization of International Epizootics, the OIE, as well as the Codex Alimentarius. And so at the administrative level, we are seeing ongoing development of mutual recognition agreements in each of these areas, all of which depend on the participation of the major trading powers, but which in effect allow for incremental progress in trade cooperation at the administrative level in specialized areas. We do not have too many, I don't think we have any participants here who are from countries that are covered by the US general preferential tariff. This is a development-oriented agreement that is under the auspices of the GATT, as well as the Commonwealth Caribbean Country Tariff, which is a specialized, a parallel agreement among members of the Commonwealth. That said, in terms of actual trade exposure, all trade agreements are not alike. I think for most countries represented here, there is a distinct regional bias in trade. That is most visible in Canada and Mexico, where 75% or more, 75 to 80% of both Canadian and Mexican exports go to the United States. And the two countries are also the largest export markets for the United States. So there's a lot of intermediate goods trade between the two countries that creates significant issues for efficient customs management. Canada's other large trading partners, CETA, the Asia Pacific Group, and the UK, but China remains a major trading partner, even in the absence of a trade agreement apart from the WTO. From a customs perspective, the impact of all these bilateral and regional agreements is to contribute to what has become known as the spaghetti bowl or noodle bowl of overlapping rules of entry as a product of what was, for a period, a product of competitive liberalization. Starting with Mexico in the years running up to 2000, many of the G20 countries actively pursued bilateral trade agreements with an extended network of countries. Mexico was the first country to negotiate a trade agreement with Japan outside the region. And the idea was to position themselves against the day when major powers would negotiate trade agreements among one another. Well, obviously, that has happened in some cases, but not in others. The EU has negotiated trade agreements with Japan, with Canada, with Mexico. And I believe there was one in process with Brazil and the Mercosur countries, although our Argentinian friends will tell us if that has survived the political upheavals of the last few years. Ironically, the regionalization of the world is also reflected in the nomenclature. For Europe, for the European Union, the spaghetti bowl reflected the effort of the European Union to develop competitive trade relations with the United States. The noodle bowl is an Asian concept, reflecting different cuisines across the Pacific. So the other major trade agreement that is more elastic than many of us in Canada would like is the USMCA, and of course that is up for renegotiation in 2025-26, subject to the original 6-year review term that was built into the agreement approved by Congress in 2020. Are there any questions with regard to this institutional or this international institutional infrastructure before we go on to the next slide? Hearing none. This chart gives you an idea of the depth of or the diversity of trade agreements in which major countries are participating. If I'd known our Peruvian friends were going to be here today, I would have added a line for Peru in this chart. Obviously, Peru is part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, not the US, not the RCEP. The other major trading partners have a diverse number of trading agreements, but they're obviously not uniform across the board. And there are negotiations underway between Australia and Canada on one hand and India on the other for a new trade agreement, although it is anybody's guess as to how many years that will take. The process of negotiating Canada's agreement with Europe, I think, took 8 years and is not fully ratified 15 years after the process started and 8 years after the agreement was reached. TPP, in addition, as I said, took about 7 years after the United States became involved. Looking at other institutional infrastructure, our friends from CBSA will be familiar with these, the diversity of laws that are the responsibility of CBSA to implement on Canadian borders. And of course, every other country represented here has its own raft of domestic legislation. So the Customs Act is the basic tool for agencies enforcing trade rules at the border. And it also includes a variety of administrative tools for the administration of sanctions and controlled goods regimes, which have become a growing part of international trade in recent years. And this is something we're going to look at in the context in the next section of the class on external shocks. Obviously, tariffs remain a significant element in policy, and each country has its own Customs Tariff Act, although its boundaries are partly defined by the terms of trade agreements that their governments have negotiated with a variety of different countries using most favored nation provisions or not. The challenges of international trade, particularly with the relationship to the subsidy of exports, has contributed to Canada's Special Import Measures Act, which authorizes anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And this has been around for a long time. It is somewhat constrained by the product of trade agreements, but obviously because the most countries have trade agreements that go well beyond their regionalized trade agreements, it remains a significant element in the arsenal of trade administration. The Export and Imports Permits Act has become a significant tool for managing controlled goods and technologies. And again, we will look at the role of the projection of export control regimes by major countries as one of the shocks that has increased the salience of controlled goods regulations, both in exports and in imports, but also in carried goods, goods that cross one country on their way to others. The Food and Drug Act remains a significant issue. International agri-food trade obviously is increasingly important. And as we have seen in a number of cases in recent years, citizens of all countries tend to have low tolerance to food safety issues arising from imported goods. And so the capacity to screen and block imports of goods that are seen to be a danger to public health is a critical area. Among developments in the institutional infrastructure that we have seen include the so-called Special Economic Measures Act and the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, colloquially known as the Magnitsky Act. These are pieces of legislation that vary from country to country that deal with trade sanctions, both in terms of dealing with conflict zones but also in dealing with human rights abuses. And there are significant differences in the national profiles or regional profiles in the European Union, the United States, and Canada, let alone countries of South America and Asia on these issues. Each of these acts requires administrative policies, whether are by national customs organizations. And, given the human resource issues discussed in the last section of the course, the actual development of administrative regulations and their communication and implementation by staff remain a major barrier to the effectiveness of these organizations. It's one thing to have rules in place. It's another thing to have them properly understood and consistently administered by officials of customs agencies. And anecdotal evidence suggests that we are a long way away from being there in many cases. And if that is true in Canada, I'm sure it is true in a number of other countries. Any questions or comments with regard to institutional infrastructure in domestic legislation? Hearing none, we will move on.
I will add
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I will just add a small comment. I think this WTO TFA itself made a huge impact on the changes on the government legislation. I'm just saying it from my experience. I think it has a quite considerable because they have like set tasks.
Yes.
So you should achieve on this date. So which makes like eventually the governments to like adopt on these aspects. Is that correct? I'm just like
where there are administrative agreements, and I'm more familiar with them in areas such as IATA and the International Maritime Organization. The targets and the timelines for the implementation of agreements are there as incentives for implementation.
Oh no, it was like a whole agreement. They have like signed all the countries with that TFA presentation agreement. So like
I think in tariffs it has been tighter because it can be administered more consistently. In many other areas, the deadlines have a way of slipping. I remember working with Emmanuel on passport regulations, which after 9/11, identification documents became extremely important for the international movement of people. And the IATA negotiated a passport standards agreement that was supposed to be implemented within 10 years. The richer countries were supposed to move faster. Countries with fewer resources were given greater flexibility to adapt, along with some degree of support, technical support in doing that. And my recollection was that the slippage of timelines was not limited to developing countries, that Canada did not get around to its 10-year passport for 15 years. And if Canada is having these issues, we have no illusions that countries without our at least notional resources would be able to keep up with those timelines. The United States, which was driving a lot of this back in 2005, they actually had a domestic piece of legislation called the Real ID Act, imposing biometric standards for driver's licenses. The only problem was that driver's licenses are not a federal responsibility, they are a state responsibility. And the states did not like the idea of a $14 billion unfunded mandate in the middle of a big kerfuffle over immigration policies. So while the majority of states are now in compliance with the Real ID Act, the target date for implementation, which was originally 2009, is now 2025.
Okay.
And potentially slipping. So the fact that we agree to timelines and dates may be useful. And when money is on the table coming in, they are extremely useful. when the money going out exceeds the money coming in, they are infinitely elastic. So I think that's a general principle. One of the reasons the trade, what was that called? The Container Institute, the Container Initiative. This was 24 years ago, so my memory is starting to go. But it was I believe it was called the Secure Container Initiative, or words to that effect. The incentive for customs officials, particularly in developing countries, to cooperate with the EU, the US, and other major trading countries, China and Japan were heavily involved at the time, was that if they implemented these systems, they could get direct shipments from major countries and the customs revenues that went with them. And so implementing new computer systems, back to the subject of technology, that could track the origins of goods, had a revenue factor that made it extremely attractive for countries, not just developing countries, but especially developing countries to participate. So Container Security Initiative, that's the name of the book. I had a student do who did an MA thesis on that, I think around 2007. But but these are the things we learn from one another as we go through. And what are theoretically best practices can be implemented if they're, depending on the institutional interests involved. What are some of the implications of the of the expansion of international trade agreements for international trade? Well, the most critical element is the interdependence of supply chain. And these are themes that have been developed in your previous section. The idea that international trade and travel require integration with the technology and process flows of major stakeholders. This is something that Alan Burson has been preaching on for 20 years. They also require supply chain analysis to reduce bottlenecks and provide effective security. The management of trade flows, the management of supply chains, has both a supply and a supply component, the companies that are participating in it, but also an administrative process for government agencies. So the whole idea of risk-based screening of trade, which came out of the efforts to improve container security after 9/11, almost 25 years ago, remains a critical part of the process. And as we get new pieces of legislation for the screening of trade, or for to manage the efforts to avoid regulation that create problems for suppliers, legal or illegal, the capacity to generate data to conduct supply chain analysis becomes a critical element. The second dimension here is that the post 9/11 measures that we've been talking about that were intended to integrate security and trade are now functioning in an increasingly unpredictable geopolitical, technological, and socio-environmental context. And we'll talk about this more in the section of the course on institutional and environmental shocks. But I don't think that there were too many people around who had anticipated the notion of a pandemic that could hugely disrupt trade. The people who, as Emmanuel Brunner-Chailly said in the last section, the people who were best prepared were the people who had already gone through such a disruption in relationship to SARS, with its epicenter in Hong Kong, one of the dominant regional ports in the Asia-Pacific region. Third factor that is coming into play, and this will be the focus of the second half of the second part of this class, is the idea that geopolitical competition is leading to supply chain disruptions that are leading to greater complexity in supply chains, the reorganization of supply chains, and greater opacity, reduced transparency in the monitoring of trade flows. And it is creating significant difficulties in tracing and enforcement of treaty commitments, whether they are bilateral or plurilateral. And the Setzer reading that was assigned for the course speaks to these in greater detail. The challenge facing customs officials in dealing with illicit trade of various kinds is that it has always been competitive. It has always been a cat and mouse game between those with responsibilities for enforcement and those who are moving goods that they do not want, who do not want enforcement measures to apply to them. And what geopolitical competition has done is that it has transferred this competitive spirit not merely to companies, but to governments themselves, which of course raises the questions of trust among national governments that is central to the efficient functioning of the international trading system. Will my cooperation or the cooperation of my country's agency with country X be reciprocated? Or is it purely a one-way street, or does it only invite episodic cooperation at the discretion of the other party? And of course, once there is a perception that cooperation is episodic, it depends on the convenience of the other party. The tendency becomes to parallel this opportunistic behavior because the rewards for ongoing cooperation are diminished in a competitive environment. One of the factors from a business perspective, I know some of you look at this from a business perspective, is to look at the difference between supply chains and value chains. The language of supply chains involves complex logistics systems for the transformation of raw materials into intermediate goods and finished products, and their distribution to customers and end consumers. So while we see a number of participants in international supply chains adding value at different places, the emphasis is generally on supply chain management, which involves processes for processing flows of goods and related services within supply chains for greater efficiency and resilience. And obviously, customs agencies are a critical element in supply chain management. And that's why we have customs brokers who are there to facilitate supply chain management by meeting customs regulations. But also why customs regulations are often designed to deal with large-scale shippers and receivers of goods. The greater the relative influence of a particular industry or industry subsector, the greater the degree to which national governments are likely to tailor their regulations to the needs of the particular industry, as long as there is continuing cooperation and compliance with customs regulations. With geopolitical competition, we see greater implications for value chains, which have emerged as interrelated activities that companies use to create competitive advantages through the location of different processing capacity. So it involves the design of different elements of the supply chain, the logistics, the production process and the distribution process to add value at different stages of these complex processes. And so obviously border processes, to the degree that they are integrated with supply chain management and value chain management, can either add value, they can detract value, or they can shift value by adding or detracting from efficiencies of supply and value chains. The whole idea of a free trade zone, which is visible in many parts of the world, is to create a set of synergies to enable value-added transformation with less complexity in managing customs regulations, including but not limited to tariffs, than would be the case with conventional trade processes. The greater the thickening of borders, the greater the incentive, often deliberate on the part of national governments, to locate production processes within the trade zone, and then for businesses to try to negotiate the supply of intermediate goods to maximize the efficiency of their production processes within that zone. And this is not a new game. If you go back into the tariff literature of the 19th century, Canadian governments typically had high tariffs on high value-added processes, but raw materials and intermediate goods which could not at the time be made in Canada would enter at a much lower tariff rate in order to maintain the competitiveness of Canadian producers. And so where you have smaller markets, the incentive to arbitrage tariff rates, to arbitrage the streamlining of customs procedures becomes that much greater, because there is a domestic, there is a set of domestic markets, a set of domestic actors that can lobby for such accommodation. And until new industries emerge that can benefit from protection, you typically do not have a competing or countervailing set of interests. And with the growing number of shocks to international trades, with growing geopolitical competition, this area of value chain management is likely to become a significant, a growing factor in international trade policies and the management of geoeconomic competition. Any questions or comments on that before we go into the discussion of institutional shocks and trade policy shocks?
Gustavo has a question.
Gustavo,
In the
yes?
chat, it says, you shared an article about deglobalization, foreign affairs.
Yes.
What do you think about the impact of deglobalization on spaghetti bowl and supply chain?
What is the impact of deglobalization on spaghetti bowls and supply chain and supply chains? Obviously, deglobalization can take a number of forms, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the next section of the class. A lot depends on whether it involves decoupling, in other words, removing certain sources, policy measures designed to actively discriminate in favor of domestic sources or regional sources at the expense of other supplies, or whether it favors de-risking the development of alternative supply chains to limit exposure to supply chain disruption resulting from political action. And that is an ongoing debate, and it's a very contested area in a number of countries. To the extent that national governments feel that major domestic interests or consumer interests that have greater policy salience, greater political salience in domestic politics are vulnerable to the interruption of supplies, To the extent that government action can facilitate a more secure supply, either by building domestic capacity or encouraging alternative external supplies, governments will have to work out on a case-by-case basis what the risk-reward ratio is for their producers, for their consumers, and for themselves as governments. We have seen that that citizens and consumers are highly intolerant of disruptions of essential goods, whether they be pharmaceuticals, whether they be safe food products, particularly staples. And while Canada hasn't had any food riots in living memory, many countries in many other parts of the world have experienced severe domestic disruptions when critical goods are interrupted and the public food chain or public health is affected. I'm thinking of the Indian government that had promoted a major pharmaceutical export industry through the basically licensing of drugs to a generic drug industry. And India was a major supplier of pharmaceutical components and pharmaceuticals to a large part of the world. But when 200 million people were exposed to COVID in 2020-21, that industrial strategy went out the window at record speed, simply because no government could survive, no government with any kind of democratic accountability could survive if thousands and thousands of people were dying at the same time as a government was exporting pharmaceuticals. And so it does, deglobalization is a response to those shocks. But in response to Gustavo's question, the precise response is likely to vary on a sector-by-sector basis, depending on alternative policy arrangements and domestic vulnerabilities. Good question. Okay, moving on to the second section of the course, we'll pick up some of these issues as we go. I want to look at 5 basic sets of issues. First of all, the growing fragmentation of the international trading system, which is one part of what Gustavo has called deglobalization. Secondly, the second major factor involves geopolitical issues and their impact on the domestic contexts of major powers. Coming out of geopolitical competition, we have a growing range of goods, both imports and exports, that are subject to trade controls. We are also seeing significant threats, both environmental and political, to supply chain security. And as governments intervene more and more in the marketplace, whether on economic grounds or political grounds, we also see elements of trade diversion and various countermeasures to contain trade diversion. So trade diversion does not imply deglobalization necessarily, but it involves a greater, it involves impacts on supply chains, sources of goods, or channels of international trade flows, so that finished goods may be produced in one country as opposed to another country, but without taking the original source of the materials out of consideration. First of all, let's look at growing trade regionalization. We see a set of gradual sector-specific tendencies in many major industrial economies towards reshoring, or the political term friend-shoring, in response to geopolitical conflicts and supply chain disruptions. The pandemic gave us one set of examples of that, where we saw access to pharmaceutical products disrupted as a result of huge imbalances between supply and demand. Domestic actions by governments in Europe, in the United States, in India, and in other countries to try to gain greater control over access to not just domestic production, but international production of not just pharmaceuticals, but also medical equipment. Some people may remember the story of New York State taking over shipments intended for other US states in order to ensure access to medical equipment in local US markets. This is akin to what we have seen recently in Gaza, with international aid not making it from the port of entry to its intended destination within the country, because people are so desperate they will help themselves before the goods get from here to there. We also have seen this in areas such as containers. Now, you may say containers are not a strategic good, but containers are part of the supply chain in as much as they contain the goods that move from goods to market. So during the pandemic, we had competition to control the flow of containers, and you had shippers in Asia who had sufficient shortages of containers that they were paying terminals in South America and North America to ship back empty containers to the other side of the Pacific in order to deal with the bottlenecks in major ports in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, and other major regional ports. And this was compounded by the fact that there was a shortage of shipping. And so the arbitrage on shipping costs between the east coast of China and Europe on the one hand and North America was so far out of balance that shipping companies could make far higher profits by shipping goods to Europe because of the escalation of differential shipping costs between Shanghai and Piraeus in Greece, as opposed to Shanghai and Long Beach or Vancouver or Lazaro Cardenas. And this is a market-based phenomenon. When it gets politicized, when it becomes a national security issue, it creates other issues entirely. And this brings us to the methodologies of how one deals with supply chain disruption and geopolitical disruptions of supply chains. And two broad approaches have been addressed, have been promoted in recent years. A more nationalist approach seeks to delink trade in order to reduce trade component. The idea being to terminate or to minimize trade relationships between two countries in order to reduce exposure to geopolitical risk. An increasingly common approach that is more nuanced seeks to de-risk trade by reducing vulnerability to geopolitical and geoeconomic pressures through supply chain diversification. So instead of putting all your supply eggs in one basket, how can one identify and secure alternate channels of supply for many goods in order to reduce the likelihood that dependence on a single dominant source will create unacceptable levels of economic disruption. Of course, there's also a third element here, and that is domestic policy responses. And of course, we have seen in Europe, we've seen in the United States, and we've seen increasingly in Canada, a trend towards the adoption of industrial strategies and explicit neo-mercantilistic approaches of privileging domestic suppliers or building new domestic industries among major Western nations or regions. And in many cases, these policies are a response to strategic trade policies in China, Russia, and other countries that have sought to leverage a dominant position in particular supply chains to serve national interests and to, in effect, to allow more or less formally or informally subsidized exports as a result of overcapacity and oversupply. And most recently, in a Canadian context, we are seeing debates over how to deal with the dominant Chinese capacity in electric vehicles in the automotive sector, when neither Canada nor the United States has been able to ramp up their supply of electric vehicles. I would argue that is not China's fault. It is a complex problem going back to significant domestic policy choices. And the fact for those of us who live in Western Canada that electric vehicles can leave you in the middle of the frozen prairie in winter without ready access to charging stations. As a consumer, that is, I consider that a rather important factor. But the reality is that China is 10 years ahead of the European Union, the United States, Canada, and other countries in the development of electric vehicles. And so given the policy mandates related to climate policy coming out, governments have to come to a choice as to whether they are going to source with the world's largest and cheapest supplier, or whether they are going to continue the process of subsidizing their own auto industries to become competitive in a market in which another country has a significant comparative advantage. And different countries will deal with this challenge in different ways, but it is if you have a domestic auto industry that is politically influential, and that is true of the European Union, it's true of the United States, it's true of Canada, it's true of countries like Brazil and Mexico, then you have to come to an answer. What is the strategic approach that can allow you to balance the interests of your own domestic producers and consumers? And the world is going to get a lot messier, whether this involves deglobalization or simply de-risking, than it is at present. Any other questions with regard to trade regionalization? Okay. So we've talked about de-risking, the diversification of supply chains to limit dependence on a single country. Those of you who like bargain footwear, I know we have Italian friends and they make outstanding footwear in Italy. But for those of us who are into bargain footwear, very interesting. Yes, Paola.
Yeah, here I am.
Okay. But if we look at the footwear industry, we see a resourcing of footwear away from traditional players to lower cost players. And what we have also seen is that countries like China are outsourcing production to subsidiaries in third countries to complement de-risking processes. I don't think there are any huge strategic questions about footwear. And producers in different countries will find their own places of comparative advantage. But it is an illustration of the relationship between de-risking and supply chains. A second de-risking approach is dual circulation. And this is something that is visible in a number of larger countries. And that involves prioritizing domestic self-sufficiency in key sectors. And this may involve the stockpiling of critical supplies, including energies, pharmaceuticals, and certain food products that are central to domestic economic security. For example, the United States has had a strategic energy reserve since the OPEC oil shocks of the 1970s. And it is expanded or contracted depending on market conditions. After the pandemic, there has been a tendency to develop domestic supply capacities in pharmaceuticals. Now, in the absence of another pandemic, it is more difficult to sustain that domestic self-sufficiency because market factors will normally kick in. And if it is not economically viable to maintain domestic capacity, then national governments have to subsidize that domestic capacity, which puts them potentially at risk of running afoul of WTO rules, unless it explicitly evokes the national security exemption under the WTO. However, you may get a complementarity of dual circulation in smaller markets if you have a trade agreement that permits the incentivizing of domestic production within a regional trade umbrella. And this is some of what has happened in Canada with respect to expanding the capacity for vaccine production. Under normal circumstances, Canada can provide its own supply of seasonal respiratory illness vaccines, flu vaccines. But for the wide range of other vaccines, it is practically uneconomic to develop a domestic capacity to do this unless one has continuing access to the markets of one's major trading partners, in our case, primarily the United States. Third factor is supply chain engineering. And this involves the development of domestic sources called reshoring, or alternative sources of supply in neighboring or allied countries with limited risks of supply disruption. And this requires some kind of cooperative mechanism between governments to avoid opportunism in the management of these supply chain engineering arrangements. I would argue that such approaches are inherently unstable when risk profiles vary from year to year, because they still require corporate decision-making on the viability of particular sources. And the greater the risks in corporate decision makers of maintaining marginal production facilities, the more likely these costs are going to be flowed through to consumers. And if governments are not willing to support that, and if consumers are not willing to support that, companies will not play by these strategies in the medium to long term. Fourth area involves leading edge technologies. And we see in particular competition among the United States, the European Union, and China with regard to leading edge technologies in key sectors. And we've also seen the use of export controls to limit the technological diffusion of these technologies, including computer chips, but also a wide variety of dual use technologies with both military and civilian potential uses in relationships between the United States and China. So this increases the challenges for customs agencies, where access to one's domestic market to certain technologies depends on the capacity to ensure the source of those technologies, that the technologies will not be repurposed or re-exported to countries outside the range of export controls. Obviously, this expands the range of opportunities for cat and mouse games between customs administrators and shippers. I would argue that in the absence of the technologies to track and control the use of goods, which is fairly labor intensive, customs agencies will always be at a relative disadvantage in that kind of game. Any questions on supply chain risks and geopolitical competition? Okay. So what are the implications of both supply chain engineering and geopolitical competition for border management? First of all, the regulatory measures used to encourage or limit trade diversion often contribute to the thickening of borders and the increasing complexity of customs administration. And as I have already referred to, more competitive approaches towards enforcement and evasion. So the result of increasing geopolitical pressures is that countries other than great powers will be encouraged either to develop dual supply chain capacity. In other words, the development of alternative supply chains for controlled goods to source outside their countries, or they will be required to invest a great deal more enforcement capacity. Given all the budgetary pressures on customs agencies, I would say that it is less likely the customs agencies will get the enforcement budgets they need, and it will become there will be a certain competition for budgets for IT projects that will come out of this. In other words, if you have limited budgets and you have multiple potential IT projects that are necessary to assist your carrying out multiple functions as a customs agency, I would think the rational approach for most customs agencies would be to prioritize IT capacity in areas of existing competence rather than trying to add new responsibilities in the absence of sufficient political pressure to change those priorities. Obviously, trade embargoes from a major supplier of controlled goods could change the incentive structures for such decisions. But given the complexity and the timelines associated with IT procurement, and our Canadian friends here today are probably all too painfully familiar with those timelines and those disruptions and those challenges. I would say that giving additional technological resources for enforcement is going to be more difficult than politics of the circumstance would normally indicate. The other factor for smaller countries, especially trade entrepôts, and those of you who are in port situations where you are in the you have a high level of transshipment with or without the transformation of goods, are probably most affected by this, is that your national government will wish to maintain as much policy discretion as possible to avoid choosing between great power preferences. And we've seen this already in the arbitraging of trade agreements between TPP and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Program, the RCEP trade agreement centered on China. Most countries of the Asia-Pacific region and the Indo-Pacific region would far rather have the opportunity to deal with a range of trading partners rather than being dependent upon one. For Mexico and Canada, those incentive structures are more complicated because of our existing dependence on US trade. And so I think if you are already within a major trading bloc, such as the United States or Mexico, Canada and Mexico with the United States, there will be a preference to avoid alignment with a major power bloc if the country's international economic relations will permit that. And of course, one set of issues that is completely outside the control of any customs officer or any customs agency is one's relative national indebtedness to particular international trading partners. So the greater the diversity of international lenders that a country is facing, the greater the flexibility, the greater the concentration of economic obligations to a particular economic partner, the greater the likelihood of being sucked into one trade alliance or another against one's overall preferences. And this is very much a case of geoeconomics. Some governments have greater foresight in these matters than others, but the failure to exercise such foresight tends to have knock-on effects, both through the public service and the economic viability of the country. Second, continuing in the discussion of geopolitical shocks, we've talked a little bit about US-China competition over technological leadership and international trade imbalances. One thing that we have seen in the last 6 years and are likely to see again after the coming presidential elections in the United States is an increase in unilateral tariffs and trade controls. The United States has already made extensive use of dual-use trade controls in a wide range of areas, including virtually the entire ICT sector. China makes extensive use of critical minerals controls, so that any industry that is dependent on Chinese sources of critical minerals, whether raw or processed, or the goods in which those critical minerals are contained, are vulnerable to trade disruptions and can approach governments and do approach governments to explore subsidy opportunities for the development of alternative supply chains. We've already talked about spillover effects in the efforts to limit trade diversion. There's a wonderful chart in The Economist, which I could not produce for this class, that shows the shift of trade from China directly to the United States to so-called alt-Asian countries, which are basically the entire Asia, the Western Asia Pacific littoral and Indo-Pacific littoral. And we have seen a sharp drop in Chinese exports to the United States, but a corresponding increase in Southeast Asian and Indo-Pacific exports to the United States. And that trade diversion, I think, is a response of supply chains and many producers inside and outside of China to the impact of unilateral US tariffs. The fact that the European Union is also considering tariffs, although more on a de-risking than a delinking, from a delinking perspective, I think increases the likelihood that we are going to see more of this kind of policy in the next few years than less. The second element of policy that we are seeing in response to this is strategic trade policy and industrial policy related to key strategic sectors. Efforts to obtain the reshoring of computer chip production, critical minerals production and processing, electric vehicle supply chains. And as noted in the Setzer article, there has been a lengthening of supply chains as major corporate networks seek to limit limit vulnerability to one country. A second major factor that has played into geopolitical conflicts is are the trade sanctions coming out of the Russia-Ukraine war. And obviously, Russia was not a passive party to these to Western in dealing with Western sanctions against Russian trade. There has been both the diversion of energy exports to India and China, and through India and China to other sources. There has been an attempted weaponization of energy and critical mineral exports. The European Union has worked extremely hard to diversify its energy imports and also imports of critical materials. And we see further shifts in regional trade patterns. The disruption of Russian natural gas exports and the Gulf Stream pipeline from Russia to the northern EU region is a critical example of energy security and diversification of import sources. Obviously, where a wide range of goods and a wide range of economic actors are being sanctioned, this creates significant customs implications. First of all, keeping up with and enforcing evolving customs sanctions regimes. The more extensive the sanctions regimes, the greater the creative efforts to evade them. And anecdotal evidence, at least, suggests that the capacity for exports has not come close, or the capacity for enforcement in countries like Canada has not come close to the expansion of the sanctions regimes, to the point that there are a number of actors who have been sanctioned who are no longer with us, but they remain on sanctions regimes. They remain on sanctions databases. And there are all sorts of complexities in enforcing these matters. Any questions on geopolitical conflicts and related domestic policy shifts? Okay. This chart, which comes out of the Setzer article, I think indicates the shifts in trading patterns resulting from sanctions, tariff wars against Chinese exports, and the impact on trade diversion. The chart on the left shows that after a dip at the end of the last decade, Chinese manufacturing exports and imports have both increased, if not to the peak levels of the period before the 2008 financial crisis. This suggests that there is a certain outsourcing of value added, but that US sanctions have not been as effective in crimping Chinese trade as perhaps suggested. What is interesting as a counterpart to that is the Chinese manufacturing surplus as a share of global GDP. And this suggests that with all trade partners taken into account, China continues to maintain enormous capacity above and beyond that of its global competitors in a number of sectors. And as a result, many producers in developing economies are facing tremendous price pressures, which some at least are likely to respond with higher tariffs. So we are seeing some structural imbalances in the international economy. We're seeing a diversification of supply chains, but the situation does not appear to be sustainable in the existing environment over the long term. Third institutional shock that has become very apparent given the effects of geopolitics is the use of expanded administrative controls on exports and imports in many We've already referenced export licensing for dual-use products to constrain technology transfer and the use of particular technologies in conflict zones. Among the complexities for customs agencies and for the users of customs services are frequent changes in these administrative controls and challenges in ensuring consistency and transparency of compliance. There are obviously considerable efforts to evade sanctions on the part of countries being sanctioned, which are leading to growing opacity of supply chains and the resources of governments to keep up, government customs agencies to keep up to these challenges is inadequate given their growth in recent years. A second major set of administrative controls, and this is particularly important for countries like Canada and Mexico, which have trade agreements with the United States, which is the country that is most aggressively pushing back against the shifting of trade due to Chinese overcapacity, is the use of import restrictions to limit the transshipment of industrial materials and components. After I prepared these slides last month, the United States and Mexico announced an agreement to limit the transshipment of goods through Mexico to evade US tariffs and controls. In 2018, during the USMCA negotiations, Canada signed an agreement with the United States to impose third-party controls over aluminum and steel imports. Complexity of this agreement could be seen by the fact that there were 54 subcategories of goods covered by the agreement that became subject to administrative processes to ensure that those goods would not be processed for re-export to the United States. We are seeing similar developments in areas related to electric vehicles, so that given the fact that Chinese and other Asian economies are several years ahead, perhaps a decade ahead in their EV supply chains, given the fact that Canada, the United States, and Mexico have all invested heavily in their in the transition of the automotive sector from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, there is enormous pressure from the United States on both Canada and Mexico to limit imports of EVs and EV components into their respective countries, which then have the potential to enter US markets in one form or another. And this creates tremendous problems for both countries' domestic capacity, because there is no way that either Canada or Mexico has the capacity to support this transition in the short term. So to create demand, much cheaper vehicles would create greater demand for these vehicles. At the same time, the greater the market share that goes to imported vehicles, the less likely the billions of dollars that have been invested into industrial subsidies to create a domestic market, a domestic production capacity will prove to be economically viable. So there is a catch-22 of the first order. And one of the questions facing both Canada and Mexico, and I think similar debates are going on in the European Union, is whether the market, whether the tariff measures brought in to correct market imbalances will follow WTO procedures or will be unilateral. There is an argument for smaller countries in particular that it is in the long term in their greater interests to follow WTO WTO anti-dumping and countervailing duty procedures to ensure that due process is followed before tariffs are imposed. However, there is enormous political pressure from suppliers to conform Canadian regulations, Mexican regulations to US regulations. And with the USMCA renegotiation or USMCA review pending within 18 months, this creates a sense of urgency in trade policy that both the current Canadian government, the current Mexican, and the incoming Mexican government are going to have to deal with, as are suppliers in Europe and any other country with a significant domestic automotive industry. Any questions on trade controls and custom and factors related to trade controls?
I think I can add a comment on the last one, the import restrictions. Correct me if I'm going towards the wrong direction. So we also had this with the economic crisis in my country. We implemented so many restrictions. We included the restrictions on these automobiles as well. We have this implementation process like back in 2020 to do like having this domestic manufacturers, but it started like assembling plants. So we kind of thought like we can accommodate the domestic market with the local production, and then we like restricted. So then, yes, it kind of accommodated the domestic market, but it was not quite effective and like sufficient, I would say.
Yes.
And which raises the prices like sky high, where also the main parties who were like supplying us the automobiles also get like significant effect because we like completely stopped purchasing from them.
Yes.
And like they also had the effect while we are also facing, still it's ongoing because we're not still opening our borders for like importation of automobiles, and the prices are like going high. So I just wanted to add the comment, so just to show the effect.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
In dealing with assembly of automobiles, as with any other complex industrial or consumer good, you have to consider the supply chain effects and not just the end use effects.
Yeah.
We saw this 45 years ago. One of the things about gray hair, it's been imposed by previous learning experiences of trade crises.
Yeah.
But we went through this in the 1980s, where there were so-called voluntary export restrictions imposed upon Japan and Korea and other producers, other automotive producers, with a view to having them relocate in Canada and the United States and later Mexico. And over 12 years, there was a significant transfer of production capacity. However, those cars did not stay at the same price point that they were in 1978 and 1980. They moved up market. So Canada now has what is called a transplant industry, the non-North American producers, with a separate supply chain in many cases, but the vehicles in question are significantly upmarket. Now, there were a lot of other economic factors that went into that process, but the key factor there was time. That there had to be a bridge built over time for the domestic economic impacts of these policies to be balanced between producers and consumers and along supply chains.
Yeah.
And so blunt instruments tend to be economically counterproductive in that way. They lead to far greater shocks than processes that can be negotiated over time. But again, that's the difference between negotiation and unilateral imposition of trade remedies. And if there is none of us expect a shift to a less protectionist administration, regardless of the outcome of the current presidential election in the United States. But there may be significant differences in the tone and in the tactics or willingness to negotiate that will spill over far beyond North American boundaries.
Yeah, Paolo's got their hand raised, and then we have another question in the chat after that.
Okay, so what's the next question?
Paolo, do you want to unmute?
Oh, yes, thanks. If I can, just a comment about transshipment. When the professor mentioned transshipment, first of all, thanks for presentation. As a custom officer, I found it particularly, interesting. And in my professional experience, I think that transshipment is a sort of great fear, great taboo for Mediterranean ports, because when I started as a young custom officer 16 years ago, okay, there was this big discussion about transshipment. Okay, the Western Mediterranean port being afraid to become ports of transshipment. But in fact, just watching at numbers, many ports in the Mediterranean, I refer, for example, to place where I'm from, Genoa, which is in the northwest of Italy. It became increasingly, okay, in the last 15 years, a port on transshipment. And other ports in Italy, Venice, but also Livorno, okay, they, I think, tried transshipment as a strategy of the growing in the short term, if I can say. And now they are repenting about it, okay, probably. I think so. I don't know. What do you think about it?
A lot depends on the extent to which different ports in a region are part of a coordinated unit as opposed to competitive units, and how that relates to the transportation networks behind the port into major industrial centers, whether in your own country or in neighboring countries. I just finished reviewing a very good book comparing port regimes in 4 different Canadian ports of entry. And it speaks of source, sinks, sources, and saddles. The sink is the consumption regime. Are you consuming the goods that are coming into the port, or is it a transshipment port? If it is a source port, does transshipment involve significant transformation within the region, in which case there is a greater economic benefit within the region? And the third factor is the saddle element, which involves the flow of goods through the port and the adequacies of service to support both the transshipment of goods and the domestic economy that is not directly related to those goods. Does it create a congestion and bottleneck in those ports? If you have coordinated port networks, and I think of the West Coast Canadian ports, Prince Rupert, the Port of Greater Vancouver, where there were multiple port authorities, but now an overarching regional port authority. And you have a regional strategy on infrastructure development, which is something that goes beyond the responsibility of customs officers, but is absolutely vital for the capacity of the customs agencies to do their jobs without massive bottlenecks. This is the policy response that either makes your job viable or puts you in a conflict between managing bottlenecks and managing flow through. And some governments manage that very well. Other governments don't try to manage it. But the capacity to have an integration of regional infrastructure strategies with customs administration is utterly critical. If the two can complement one another quite nicely, but if they are not both there, and if they are not tailored to the circumstances of the region, it becomes quite difficult. The big issue from the transshipment perspective is where you have heavily protected sectors that are at a comparative disadvantage. So if you have domestic sectors and they are upgrading or transforming the goods into higher value added goods, that is a sufficiently common strategy that the government can work with it to mutual advantage. It is where transshipment becomes a source of regional conflict, where there are other countries within a regional trade agreement. And I am not privy to the discussions between the Italian government and the German government in this area. And it goes beyond the jurisdiction of most customs agencies. But this is an example of how a policy debate between two governments within a region creates either tensions or opportunities that flow back into the customs administration environment. So one is the broader economic sector. One is the broader economic consideration around port structures and infrastructure and integration with regional economies. And the second is a political debate between governments that funnels back into conditions for the operations of customs agencies.
Thank you so much.
Okay. And there you had another question there?
Gustavo says, can this shock have a huge impact in Canada and Mexico, but not in South America?
My impression is that South American governments have been working with Chinese producers. But I'm not privy to their schedules in terms of industry conversion and whether they had made the same kind of domestic investments in trying to bring about an auto industry transformation. I think part of the problem of North American governments is that the rapidity of the attempted transformation and the subsidization of that transformation has been taken independently of broader international trade concerns for political reasons. And I'm not aware of Brazil and Argentina moving in the same direction as rapidly, which makes it easier to work with investors from other countries to achieve a more gradual transformation of their domestic industries. So it may be a case that Brazil and Argentina have had enough other challenges that their governments have not chosen to create this one for themselves.
We also have a hand up from David.
Go ahead, David.
I have a quick anecdote and then a question. I have a friend who works at a Ford dealership, automotive dealership, and they were going through this practice of importing Ford Transit vans from Europe that were configured as a passenger van with 3 rows of seating. And upon arrival to the dealership, his job was to remove all of the seats and strip it down so that it could serve as a commercial vehicle for a tradesperson. And the reasoning was that importing a vehicle for commercial purposes is much more expensive for tariffs and import than a passenger vehicle. And so all these seats he removed, they would just ship back to Europe to just circulate again. So my question is that an example of a transshipment as a means of getting around a tariff through shipment?
It's not a transshipment, but it is very definitely a means of getting around a tariff. That is very creative. It may even be legal, and absent somebody changing the rules. But I think that would probably fall into the category of tax avoidance as opposed to tax evasion.
Okay.
But that is exactly the kind of economic adaptation that people use to triage regulations that no longer make economic sense for them. And along with the creativity of a competitive marketplace that is very difficult for policymakers to keep up with. Okay,
it boggles me that it's still efficient for them to ship all that stuff back to Europe and it still be, and all the labor involved, and it still be cheaper than just paying the tariffs.
Well, we are all familiar with the fact that a very significant portion of automotive trade in North America still takes place under the WTO tariff rather than the USMCA CUSMA-TMEC tariff, because the rules of origin on the latter are so complicated that small producers just find it easier to pay the tax up front and work with it. So the greater the complexity of the rules, the greater the incentive for small producers to find the most cost-effective way of working around. And sometimes, sometimes they make for amusing anecdotes like the one you shared with us.
Thank you.
There was another question there, Emma?
That's all.
Okay. Okay. It's the same reason, I suppose, that people are shipping Canadian oil to the east coast of Canada through Vancouver and the Panama Canal, which strikes me as a terribly convoluted way to get a shipment across Canada.
We have some comments though. Allah says barely legal, and Lauren says vehicles imported into Canada carry a 6.1% rate of duty on average, among other OGD requirements to meet.
Okay, so one comment says barely legal. So we'll see if it's barely legal enough for you to try to enforce it. And if you don't, it's barely legal. And a 6% tariff on commercial vehicles?
6.1 rate of duty on average.
On average. So
Among other.
the question is, did the customs agent who quoted them their tariffs on the commercial vehicles actually give them an average rate? Because I know dealing with CBSA going back 40 years, one of the great challenges of customs administration was getting consistent interpretations across ports of entry over the years. So it may be, if there's only a 6% rate of duty, it's strange that people would be going to all that effort. But a lot depends on whatever interpretation the local dealership is getting. Okay. Supply chain security. This is a fourth international shock, and this applies less to customs agencies than it does to the supply chain more broadly. The reality is that during the pandemic and during subsequent conflict events, we have seen the vulnerability of many supply chains to disruption. And this includes some issues that were noted previously, shortages or price shocks for international shipments, or even for such tools of international trade as containers. Competition and national protectionism for medical supplies and vaccines, although governments took action to mitigate these shortages through bilateral or international agreements and provisions for voluntary licensing. Choke points or disruptions in international trade corridors. And this can be from natural disasters or environmental disasters. And of course, in Canada, we have had huge issues with both flood and drought. Flood contributing to the disruption of major trade routes within Canada. Drought affecting not only wildfire conditions that can result in production shutdowns in major industries, but also in water levels a continent away in the Panama Canal. We have seen growing numbers of international conflicts. Most countries do not wish to run the risk of shipping freighters or tankers through the Red Sea during the Israel-Gaza conflict for want of protection against missiles from Yemen. There are a number of failed states along major trade corridors that have contributed to the growth of piracy. We have the conflict between China and its neighbors in the South China Sea. Other factors can be domestic, social conflicts such as blockades of major trade routes or port strikes, which were significant issues both in the major port of Long Beach, Los Angeles, Long Beach in the United States, and in different ports in Canada. And of course, potential failures in critical infrastructure that disrupt trade. So these have an indirect impact on customs, but they have a very distinct impact on trade flows and the continuity of shipments, creating a situation in which countries and their major corporations need to build in a just-in-case element into their supply chains, not simply just in time. Various responses to supply chain security. We referred to this a little earlier in the discussion. Pressures for greater cooperation among port and airport authorities, port terminals, shipping, rail, and other transportation companies. Obviously, in major port settings, there is a need for cooperation among both governmental and private sector agencies to manage trade flows. A second major policy response that includes but goes well beyond customs agencies is the identification and removal of bottlenecks within supply chain networks. Now, one area that can affect customs agencies is staffing issues, but staffing issues go beyond customs agents to include people responsible for unloading goods, inspecting goods, and so on. Transportation choke points, again, well beyond customs responsibility, but a major factor in the timing and reliability of shipments. Labor relations. Security screening in major port authorities, the presence of organized crime, and the screening of staff to prevent penetration by organized crime is a critical issue. There are a number of ports of entry in Canada that have been subject to major thefts, as well as the endemic shipment of illicit goods. Interactions with local communities, again, not a customs issue, but a major social license issue for port authorities. And managing regulatory overlap, where there are multiple agencies that are trying to manage shipments through a particular port. And this may particularly apply to the shipment of dangerous goods or other factors involving environmental hazards, for example, large amounts of dust or what have you, which can trigger responses from local communities. And I know that both European countries and North American countries have faced a fair bit of community pushback in this area. All of these bring into consideration fiscal and budgetary considerations that in most cases, infrastructure investments are dealt with on a project by project basis, but given the number of projects along a particular supply chain or in a particular port region, multi-year funding is a critical factor in maintaining the viability of ports and dealing with competition among ports. Because just because you stand still doesn't mean you're a neighboring jurisdiction or an alternative jurisdiction 1,000 miles away may not make significant investments that can affect supply chains. One of the big factors affecting the Canadian Pacific Kansas City Railway merger of a couple of years back was the fact that the government of Mexico had made major investments in the port of Lázaro Cárdenas. And Kansas City Southern was the one Class 1 railroad in the United States that had capacity to source products from that port. So it creates a third ocean capacity for a railway system and for the suppliers and shippers who are using that railway system, which again has seen the Port of Vancouver in Canada drop from one of Canada's leading ports to one of the lowest rated international ports in the world in terms of customer service. Again, with fiscal and budgetary considerations, governments are not the only players. A key factor involves leveraging private sector investment. And where it does affect customs agencies particularly, involves investments in new technology, the automation of cargo handling, because the greater the degree to which cargo handling is automated, the more customs procedures have to be adapted to these new process flows. And critically, in the modern environment, IT security. Businesses share information to the extent they know it is going to be secure. Governments are vulnerable, as are private sector actors, to industrial espionage, to industrial sabotage through hacking. And so IT security and the training of personnel necessary to maintain IT security remains a critical factor in supply chain security. Any questions on that before we move on? Okay. I'm going to skip over this slide. Other emerging issues. This is a bridge to our practicum issue, the practicum section, of course. One factor that is coming into play, particularly in North America, but also to some degree in Europe, I believe, is the involvement of forced labor with various contributors to supply chains. There are regulatory trends in Europe, in the United States, and Canada towards greater due diligence in identifying risks of forced labor, especially in lower wage countries for international supply chains. And these risks are not limited to authoritarian countries. Now, one of the challenges, as in many other areas of international trade, is that national and regional, such as EU regulatory regimes, differ widely. I don't know if this is a significant issue in Latin America, but certainly it has become a growing issue in the United States, in Europe, and to some degree in Canada. Now, one of the issues raised in a previous section of the course today was the need for cooperative databases or cooperative sharing of databases in dealing with allegations of misconduct, especially, but not only in closed societies. Where you have an authoritarian government or closed society, obviously the risks of reporting misconduct are significantly increased. However, one of the industries that has been subject to increasing media scrutiny in North America is the international seafood industry. And not simply in the fishing industry, which has always been a tough business, going back hundreds, if not thousands of years, but also in the fish processing industry with the use of migrant labor. And so monitoring behavior and dealing with supplier-based misinformation is a critical challenge in assessing supply chain issues. Now, a number of countries have taken a number of different measures for mitigation of forced labor issues. This is more difficult in dealing with supplies from authoritarian countries, but it is an increasingly politically salient area. The rules vary from country to country, but the greater the effort that companies make to demonstrate that they have done due diligence, the greater likelihood they have a defense in dealing with such matters. But customs agencies have far greater latitude in the United States than they do in Canada. And the resources for enforcement in Canada remain in their infancy. I do not know what the resources for enforcement are in Europe, but again, I suspect it is largely a matter of media salience and political salience as to whether customs agencies would mandate more aggressive enforcement given all the demands that they are under. In addition to that, there is the challenge of dealing with conventional border enforcement priorities in the midst of a shift in international regimes. And obviously, there are a variety of conventional enforcement priorities. Customs rules and tax collection, traditional. Drug smuggling, an area in which there's long-standing cooperation among many customs agencies. Gun smuggling has been a Canadian priority, although I gather that other countries are paying more attention to it as well. Human smuggling, and of course, perennially, food safety. And there is growing collaboration among countries in managing food safety issues. But this is an area in which Asia Pacific countries have tended to be more demanding than North American countries, unless there are particular disease-related flashpoints. And as a result, domestic food safety agencies are often tasked with the enforcement of foreign food safety rules as a condition of receiving expedited customs processing. Other priorities, post 9/11, obviously, we have had counterterrorism issues and the monitoring of money laundering issues. Canada has had many weaknesses in this area, so we cannot point the finger against any other country, but it is a growing concern across international borders. Other factors involve counterfeit currency shipments, cryptocurrencies, a technology issue, and of course, additional controls over munitions and dual-use technologies as a result of the Russia-Ukraine and other conflicts. So, in effect, being in the customs business is anything but boring these days, even amidst the vast amount of routine work that is necessary to make the system work. And we owe you a debt of gratitude for the professionalism that is so often displayed and encouraged in managing customs agencies, both to enforce the law and to provide the level of public service that your shipping and transportation communities desire to see, and making the two work together. Okay, so I'm going to break it here. If there are any other questions, I'd be happy to take them, and then we will move to the practicum after the break.
Yes, just quickly, back to the very start of your presentation. Why is it that the US has blocked the WTO's tribunal, like appointment of new people to the tribunal?
I think three issues. Number one, in the Trump administration in particular, there was a sense that the tribunals were going well beyond what the US administrations had felt was the spirit of the regulation. The fact that the Biden administration has not changed the policy one iota indicate that this is not a Trump problem. It is a broader perception within the US Office of the International Trade Advisor and Department of Commerce. There is a desire for an amendment to the rules governing the dispute resolution mechanism. And the problem with the WTO is that things move glacially. And I think the best interpretation is that while the United States wanted to see changes, the system was not geared to make changes at anything like the pace the Americans wanted to see. And as a result, the only way the Americans could get the attention of major trading partners in a consensus-driven environment was to blow up the process. The reality is that is not likely to change in the near future. There have been a number of discussions, as I understand it, between the U.S. Department of International Trade and its counterparts among major trading countries, EU, China, Japan, India, as the dominant countries. But they are nowhere near a consensus on moving the dispute resolution system as far as the Americans are willing to see it go. And that is a recipe for gridlock. And in the absence of a dispute resolution system, the Americans have greater discretion in applying their Section 301 rules. And after all, when you are accustomed to exercising discretion in your own interests, why would you abandon that discretion unless you can get something really significant in return? So we now have a new status quo. And the challenge is for the countries that have signed on to the new alternative dispute resolution mechanism, which includes several major Latin American countries, European Union, China, Japan, and Canada. Can we make this work or not? And I'm not familiar enough, unfortunately, with literature, but I see very, very little media coverage of resolution of decisions. So whatever is happening, it's happening under the radar. And that may be the way the powers want it, but it doesn't give us a clear picture of how well the system is working.